Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're delighted to have you all here with us for today's webinar titled A World of Differences, a discussion on human variation and its role in early childhood program development, implementation, and evaluation. My name is Jeremy Guardiola, and I'm advisor for strategic initiatives to Dr. Jack Shonkoff here at the Center on the Developing Child. Whether you're joining us for the first time or have been a regular at our webinars here at the Center, we're happy to have you with us. Today's webinar is grounded in the latest working paper from the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. The Council is a multidisciplinary, multi-university collaboration committed to closing the gap between what we know and what we do to promote successful learning, adaptive behavior, and a lifetime of sound physical and mental health for all young children. The Council's 17th working paper, published 2 months ago, focuses on the many ways that genes, experiences, and exposures and the timing of those environmental influences all interact to shape each child's development and health in different ways. The fact that individual variation is the norm and not the exception offers us a chance to reconsider how we can improve program design and delivery to achieve greater impacts for all children. The paper also addresses the differences we see among socio-demographic groups, typically defined by parental education, family income, race, or ethnicity. Unlike individual variation, these group differences have no genetic basis. When disparities in outcomes exist, they are associated with structural inequities such as systemic racism and intergenerational poverty that lead to higher exposure to adversity and decreased access to opportunities for some neighborhoods, families, and individuals compared to others. Drawing on rigorous science, the working paper offers a framework to help policymakers and program managers expect variation in their effectiveness and therefore plan for flexible implementation to ensure as many children as possible have their basic needs met and can receive specialized services when needed. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions when registering for this event. We received many submitted questions and will be incorporating some of them into the conversation. Of course, we won't have time to address all of the questions that were submitted, and we'll be thinking about how that can inform future conversations. Without further ado, I'll introduce our panel. First, we will hear from Dr. Jack Shonkoff to help frame the concept of variation or human difference. Jack is the Julius B. Richmond Family Professor of Child Health and Development at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital, and founding director of the university-wide Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. He currently chairs the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, whose mission is to bring credible science to bear on public policy affecting children and families, and the JPB Research Network on Toxic Stress, which is developing new measures of stress activation and resilience in young children. Then we will turn to a panel discussion featuring 2 outstanding guests. Fernando Martinez, MD, is a Regents Professor and Director of the Asthma and Airway Disease Research Center at the University of Arizona, Tucson. He is a world-renowned expert in the field of childhood asthma. Primarily, his interests are the natural history, genetics, and treatment of childhood asthma. His groundbreaking research has had an impact on his field in numerous ways, most prominent being the development of the concept of early origins of asthma and COPD. Additionally, Dr. Martinez has made important contributions to our understanding of the role of gene-environment interactions and in the development of asthma and allergies. Dr. Martinez currently serves on the National Scientific Council of the Developing Child, the NIAID Board of Scientific Counselors, and was a board member for the NHLBI National Advisory Council for 3 years. Dr. Russell Booker is Chief Executive Officer of the Spartanburg Academic Movement, a place-based community movement in Spartanburg, South Carolina that he will share more about later. A devoted champion of education and community service, he brings 30 years of diverse experience in the field. Under his leadership, Spartanburg Academic Movement is driving an ambitious integrated economic mobility plan called Movement 2030, aimed at providing thousands of children in Spartanburg with a pathway to upward mobility. A former superintendent of Spartanburg County School District 7, he currently chairs the Strive Together Board of Directors, serves as a board director of Purpose-Built Communities, and holds roles as a trustee at Wingate University, the Mary Black Foundation, and the Spartanburg Regional Hospital Foundation. And finally, we're lucky to have the center's Deputy Director and Chief Engagement and Partnerships Officer, Corey Zimmerman, leading this conversation today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jack to begin our discussion.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I assume you can all hear me? Yes? Okay. I'm just going to be pretty brief because I really want to leave most of the time for our two wonderful presenters. But let me just say a little bit about this concept of variation and what it is and what it isn't. Okay, so we start just from a basic lived experience perspective. Anybody who knows a family with more than one child understands the concept that you can live in the same family, live in the same household, and it's rare that the children are all exactly the same. So variation, as Jeremy just said, is really kind of the norm. It's not the exception. But what we want to do this morning is to just really make a clear distinction between understanding what we mean by individual variation, which is child by child, in contrast to how we tend to categorize parts of the population and talk about variation among different groups defined by social class, parent education, race, ethnicity. I have to say that I really found it very enlightening and appreciate all of you who sent in questions in advance, because what those questions showed, there were many of them, showed how much we have been programmed to think about variation in terms of categories of people with defined boundaries. And we tend to then generalize about each of these groups and say, that's what we mean by variation. Now, that variation by groups is very important because it has a huge impact on policies and programs and resource allocation. And particularly, it's useful to recognize which populations where people live really are deserving of more allocation of resources to address inequities and access to opportunities and access to hardships and threats. But what I want to tee up for the conversation this morning is the fact that we lose the notion of individual variation within groups, within programs, within families. And I'm actually going to set this up by naming three very significant challenges facing the early childhood field right now. Some of them old challenges, they've been around a long time, some of them new. And interestingly, I think lived experiences are going to lead the way toward addressing these challenges better than research and policy will. So I kind of want to put them up as examples and then turn it over to Fernando and Russell to kind of bring both a research and a community perspective. So the first is this focus on social determinants of health and ACE scores. I think pretty much all of you in the audience are familiar with at least one of those two, if not both. Social determinants of health and ACE scores are a very reliable source of population-level measures of differences among groups. And they're valuable to decide priorities for resource allocation. Where are the communities? Which population groups need to get more than their fair share of resources because they've had more than their unfair share of hardships and threats? But the problem with just thinking about variation by groups is that we end up stereotyping children and families by the groups we put them in. And I thought it was really interesting in many of the questions where people not only raised issues about race, ethnicity, parent education, family income, but also bringing in the question of variability related to neurodiversity, related to disabilities. And I think we have in our minds that variation has to do with groups. So what I want to say a few words about right now is why that's it's helpful, but really a problem if that's the only way we think about variation. So first, I want to say something about ACE scores. I'm going to be a little bit controversial on all of this because I think we really need to come to grips with some of these challenges. ACE scores, which for those of you who don't know them, are a ranking of 10 events, usually within a family, associated with early trauma. And they have been shown to be associated, the more traumas you experience early on, the more problems you have with health later. ACE scores do not address issues of timing. It's a big difference between adversity that occurs when you're 6 months old, 18 months old, 2 years old, or even prenatally. And it really underscores the fact that we have not paid enough attention to the impact of adversity, even bringing prenatally. I think Fernando will probably have something to say about that. The problem is when ACE score is used as an individual measure of variation, it is scientifically inaccurate, and it presents huge problems of unfairly labeling children as being at risk for problems as individuals. It also disregards the fact that many children who are experiencing trauma are not poor, they are not children of color, and we have these stereotypes to overcome. The second issue, which I think most of you will relate to immediately, is the attending to individual variation in sensitivity to context is one of the strongest untapped arguments we have for why it is essential that effective programs that will return a good margin of investment have to involve the recruitment, the retention, and appropriate compensation of well-trained staff who are prepared to deal with the range of problems and needs that children will present and the range of differences that children will present, and have to have the flexibility and the capacity to modify what they're doing based on difference in children. I was in Spartanburg, Russell, if you allow me to say this, I think several weeks ago, and everywhere I went, there are examples of people on the ground who actually live and breathe modifying what they do based on how children are responding to the interventions. The Perry Preschool Project is a very good example. I'll briefly mention it. I assume everybody here knows the Perry Preschool Project. It's an iconic program. We use the return on investment data for that program, which is now well over half a century ago, to illustrate how much we get back for every dollar we spend. Those teachers in that program were not only well paid, well trained, and highly valued for the work they were doing, but most people don't know that they met at least once a week to discuss how they were modifying that curriculum for children based on how they were responding. And this is not a question of normal or abnormal development. It's a question of variation within a wide range of normality in the general population. And the third issue, and then I'll pass the baton, relates to the question of how we evaluate the impacts of programs and how we define what we mean by an evidence-based program. So basically, the definition of an evidence-based program is a program that's been studied in a well-controlled way, well-designed and well-implemented, and ends up with a statistically significant difference between the group that got the intervention and the group that did not. And if that difference is statistically significant, you have earned the designation of an evidence-based program. And that's a good start. I'm not criticizing the importance of evidence-based programs, but the problem is that the definition of evidence-based means the average effect of the program was statistically significant. And I'm sure many of you in the audience will relate to what I'm about to say. You're involved with a program or you know a program, and the latest study comes out, and it's disappointing. You say, wait a second, we have much bigger impacts than that evaluation is showing. And the interesting thing is that the evaluation has been done well. It shows a very modest average impact. You say, I see bigger impacts every day. You're right, you do see bigger impacts every day, that's real. But there are also children in the program who are showing less significant impacts. And there are always children and families in a program who are getting no benefits from the program because of this nature of individual variation. So the way we evaluate our programs and the way we learn continuously about how to increase our impacts is holding us back because it is not acknowledging the issue of individual variation among the treatment group. What we should be asking is not, does a program work, but for whom does it have big impacts? How do we figure out what it is about those who are having big impacts and start replicating and scaling for that? Who is it having small impacts with, and how do we increase what we do? And who is it having no impacts with? And let's stop doing that and figure out how to modify and improve what we're doing. And the best source of knowledge for that is actually people working on the ground in families. They know where things are working well and they know where not. So I think the research community and the policy community would move us great leaps forward by an appropriate dose of humbleness and humility by partnering with service providers and families to together figure out how we confront the issue of individual variation and not just continue to categorize children and families and assume that that's telling us something important. So I will stop right here. All of you in the audience, you're in for a real treat to hear from Fernando, Martinez, and Russell Baker. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Jack. So I'm going to be our facilitator, moderator for this next part of the conversation. I'm delighted to have both of you here on screen with us. And for the audience, please know that we have taken into account the questions that you all submitted in advance and woven them in throughout to the questions that we're going to have. Fernando, let me start with you. As Jack has just teed up, it's now widely accepted that investing in early childhood development helps build the foundations of a healthy, productive, and equitable society. Further, there's a range of broad-based programs and targeted services that clearly make a difference for millions of young children. But when you look closer at the program evaluation research, and this is what Jack was just talking about, we see that some children are benefiting greatly from those programs and some are benefiting less and some not at all. And this is where the opportunity is, right? So increasing the effects for all children, especially those who are currently benefiting the least, may be the key that could unlock greater impacts for society. So how can science help us here? How can we understand why the same experiences affect children differently? So the question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to suggest you unmute before answering. Fernando, can you tell us about children's development and how it varies based on the interactive influences of genes and experiences and timing? And welcome you to bring in examples from your experience studying asthma in your work.
Thank you so much, Corey, and good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and have the chance to discuss this very exciting new working paper by the Council. Just to understand and answer your question, a little bit of a very brief and very simple introduction to some biological issues seems to me important. When we got the results of the Human Genome Project, there were several very important conclusions that we reached. The first one was that humans have 2.3 billion units in our genome. These are the so-called base pairs. And the other thing we discovered is that if you take any human randomly and compare all humans to that human as a mean, we have 20 million differences between that human chosen randomly and as a mean all the other humans. So there's a lot of differences between humans, but we are 99.84% similar, identical to each other genetically. Those two factors are very important. The total number of variation that we have discovered already is 324 million. So there's a lot of difference, but as a mean, we are 99.9% the same. Now, the other thing we discovered, because we also sequenced animals, is that humans are more similar between them than, for example, other primates are similar between them. And Inuit has higher probability of being more similar than a person living in Africa or born in Africa with an African ancestry than how similar two chimpanzees in Central Africa are. We are a species in which we are very similar between each other. Therefore, the first thing, and we will go back to this later, is that it makes absolutely no sense. It is absolutely ridiculous to say that groups of humans are different genetically between them because they look different externally. We are the same species, and we are even more similar than other primates are between them. But there are a lot of differences between us. And then the next question is, why is it that we are different? What difference does it make, if you, no pun intended, what difference does it make to be different? And of course, it creates the differences that you can see and watch between people. But there's one characteristic that is behind that difference between us that is very important, in that we respond differently to the environment. And that is the one that is at the center of our attention today. And when I say to the environment, I mean to exposures in the environment, I mean to education that is given to us, I mean to violence, whatever it is that it comes to us from the outside, humans respond very differently from each other, very differently. And there's a wide variation. In my practice, I see it every day. Children respond very differently to the medicines that we give them for asthma. And all the time I tell the parents, call me please, call our office if the child seems not to be responding to the medicines we're giving. Because we know, and there's a discipline called pharmacogenetics in which we're studying the subtle differences, genetic difference between people in determining response to therapy. But that are not the only differences between us. The other big difference is that while we are developing, when we are getting influenced by the environment, subtle changes are occurring both in our DNA and in our body. And that globally we call epigenetics. There are marks that are left in us, in the significant part in our DNA, but also in the way our brain grows, in the connections that are established between, excuse me, between cells in the brain, but not only that, cells in our whole body. We are being modeled by the way we grow. And therefore, there are two things that are important, which Jack was talking about before, which is, one is when those influences occur. We all know that to be a concert pianist, you need to start learning very, very early. Otherwise, you're never going to be a concert pianist. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Because when you're young, you're more sensitive, much more sensitive. You're much more malleable. You're the most malleable when you're in utero. We know that if the mother smokes, it's much worse if the mother smokes when the child is in utero than when the child is outside. Still bad, but it's worse because the child is much more sensitive when the child is in utero. So all those changes caused by the environment in us change the way we're going to respond in the future. So we are a collection of changes that are stored in us along our development, together with the genetic variation with which we're born.
So helpful. It was so clear. All of those pieces, I really like how genes, and then why this difference, and that's about our experiences, and then timing. And I wonder if I don't know if there's more you want to say on timing, because I think that's the piece that always fascinates me, or like draws me to the early childhood space, is because the timing of experiences and how it affects development matters. I don't know if there's any more you want to say on that, and then I'll move to Russell, but any other thoughts on timing?
Sure. I think timing is the most important part of it all. And the reason is that if you consider influences without considering the timing in which they occur, you're not going to be able to really understand the way they influence the future of that particular child. Let me give you an example. We now know that the most influential period in which environmental exposures influence the development of asthma, interacting with the genes we come to our world with, as we said before, is in utero and during the first 1 to 2 years of life. Mm-hmm. Those are the most important periods for asthma. Mm-hmm. Once you go through that period, certainly you can change asthma, what we call secondary prevention. In other words, once the changes that have occurred that will determine your risk for asthma have occurred, is much more difficult to change them, but you still can. But the most important differences occur very early in life. Therefore, the timing is very important. Mm-hmm. Just very briefly, one example. There is a product in the environment produced by bacteria. That product is called endotoxin. The details are given in the document, but I can say very briefly that if you're exposed to doses of endotoxin early in life, that is protective for you because the body learns how to deal with endotoxin, a bacterial product. It learns how to respond to it. Mm-hmm. If now you're exposed to endotoxin later, but you were not exposed early, you don't know how to respond to it. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you respond in the wrong way to it. Mm-hmm. Something that was good for you in the right doses early. Extreme doses are bad for everybody, but in the right doses early is good for you early, but it is bad for you later because you didn't learn how to do it. The changes that occur in us allow us to, in a better way, respond to the same exposure later in life.
So fascinating. And I have found too that it's the early that period, that sensitive periods of development, that it works for interventions too, right? Like it means your body, you can intervene because your body's exquisitely sensitive to what's happening in the environment, and that's for positive and for negative experiences, that it can go both
exactly
ways.
That way.
All right, let's turn to you, Russell. So I want to bring the science together with initiatives that are working directly with children and families. And you lead the Spartanburg academic movement in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is a place-based effort. Can you help us understand more about what is a place-based effort? I know that's a particular term to describe a philosophy and kind of theory of change. What's unique about that type of approach, this type of approach to creating environments that support young children's health and development?
Yeah, so great question, and such an honor to be with all of you today. So our organization is about 10 years old now, and I don't know if you can see just over my shoulder, there's a book written by David Brooks titled The Second Mountain. And I bring that up because David Brooks spent some time in Spartanburg, and in October of 2018, he published a column in the New York Times, did a really good job explaining exactly what a place-based effort involved. And then he had a chapter in this book called Community Building, where he talks about Spartanburg and some of the networks that are doing this kind of work. So I share that for anybody that might want to go and look that column up. Our organization started with a single purpose, and that was to raise the level of post-secondary degree attainment in Spartanburg, an old mill town here in upstate South Carolina. After a year or so, we learned that just focusing on that single metric alone without working from prenatal all the way through the continuum would never get us there. So we actually brought two organizations together, one that was focusing on early care and education, one that was focusing on edutainment, and the Spartanburg Academic Movement was born. We focus on raising outcomes in 7 areas, making sure our young people are ready for school, reading proficiently by 3rd grade, middle grades transitions are critical, high school graduation, enrollment, persistence, completion, and workforce. That's great. So we spent a lot of years focusing on that. And then a few years ago, we came to realize that to Fernando's point and to Jack's point, if we're not really focusing on the environment and the lived experience, we're not going to get to where we need to be. So our work continues to focus on those things that I just mentioned, but there are 5 things that we're really trying to focus on now. So when we think about a place-based effort, Corey, number one, there's a specific geographic focus. And, across communities, it may look different. Here in Spartanburg, some of our work is done at the county level, 360,000 residents. Some of our work is done at the city level, but there are 2 specific neighborhoods that we're supporting in our work, the North Side community and the Highland community. And I'll talk about why that's so important in just a second. So really defining what the geographic location is critical to the place-based work, first and foremost. Number 2, it's all about local engagement and that cross-sector collaboration. So Fernando talked about the asthma treatments and, telling families, if this isn't working, because it may vary from family to family. Well, we know the same thing is true of our neighborhood. So we prioritize community involvement and asking them to share with us, what's working, what's not working. So really bringing in the voice of families, students, and the community in this work for those initiatives that we're helping to drive is critical. But the other big part of this is also bringing in those large systems. So how do we bring government together, school districts, our 7 higher ed institutions, businesses, healthcare, our nonprofit sector, our philanthropic sector, bringing all of those entities together to create a comprehensive support. And we refer to that as collective impact in our world. The third thing I'll note that is so critical to this is that all of our decisions are data-driven. In 2020, we convened our community around a major effort that Jeremy mentioned during my introduction called Movement 2030. It's a 7-year comprehensive economic mobility plan, but that all began with us really taking a look at where the needs were the most. That's why the data is so important. Variation comes in because, we've got a large county, but we really needed to narrow the scope to where we needed to bring these interventions and efforts to bear the most. 2 more things I'll just note that are critical to place-based work, and that is making sure that there are tailored interventions in this work. So we're trying to design and implement strategies that are really tailored to the specific needs of the county in instances and in a lot of instances, the two neighborhoods that I just referenced. And the beauty of the work at the neighborhood level now is that we can really finely tune what we're trying to do to make sure that culturally, socially, and economically, we're working within the context of that community. And then finally, the last thing that we try to do in this work is making sure that what we're doing is sustainable. And that means building local capacity within neighborhoods and across the community, fostering leadership at the neighborhood level so they can show up and intervene and drive, some of their own outcomes, and then creating proof points along the way so we can institutionalize these practices so that it can be sustaining. So to boil it down, our mission at SAM is simple. It is to ensure Spartanburg County's children's success by convening partners, aligning resources, and driving equity. What's unique about it, let me say this, we're not the only organization that's doing this kind of work. We are part of a larger network called Strive Together. And there are some 70 place-based partnerships within the Strive Together network aligning around a similar framework. We're also a part of a national network called Purpose-Built Communities. There's some 20-odd purpose-built communities across the country working in the context of neighborhoods around a comprehensive framework. So to be able to bring those two national intermediaries to bear in Spartanburg is really helping us think about this work on a much deeper level. What is unique about our work right now and what's different is, as I shared earlier, we have a comprehensive strategy. And that comprehensive strategy centers around three major areas. The first one is countywide, and this is our work in early care and education. And I'll talk about Hello Family in just a moment, but it really does support all of our families across Spartanburg from prenatal until they're ready to enter school. On the other side of the data bridge, a lot of our work is now centering countywide around making sure our children are getting to college, completing college, and gaining that job with the path. And then two neighborhoods, as I mentioned, are at the center of our work. It is through those two neighborhoods that we're hoping to learn more, to go deeper, and to be able to scale that work across the board.
That was so helpful also. I have such a sense of what makes a place-based initiative and and it's such a unique way of coming to change and really trying to support a community. I won't try to summarize them back, but really I have a clear picture in my head of what makes it and what you're doing that's unique there in Spartanburg. So let me connect it.
Well, and to your point, I'll just mention, you said backbone, which is such a key word. You do need an organization within the community to serve as the quarterback, the backbone, to be that convener. And that's what we do.
Yes. Yeah, that makes total sense. So let me bridge now between the two. So I'm curious, Russell, as you were hearing these concepts of variation and sensitivity to context, and I'm curious, what about them resonated or not with your experiences in leading a place-based initiative? The science makes sense, but this kind of, how do we bridge it into action, into practice? What resonated and what was I don't know about that. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
So I'll be honest. So the first conversation I had with Jack, he was talking about this human variation and heterogeneity, and it scared me to death. I'm like, whoa. So Jack mentioned that he was in Spartanburg during the end of May, and he and Jeremy, we convened about 7 different groups for them to meet with. Everyone from our faith initiative to our racial equity collaborative. But I want to mention 2 groups that we convened. One was a group of educators where we were able to sit and just have a round table conversation about their work. Jack was just here to listen and learn about the work they were doing. And the other, we were on the north side at our early learning center, the Franklin School, and we brought community members in to talk about the work. And as they would sit there and talk about the things they were doing and how they were trying to reach children and families, how they just had to go deeper and deeper and deeper, with specific children, Jack would look over at me and say, "That's heterogeneity," or "That's variation." And it was through that conversation, Corey, that I was like, okay, I think I get it now. It's not as complicated as we try to make it to be. The challenge on my end is we don't do direct services with children.
Yeah.
Now, when I was a teacher, I was a coach, I was a counselor, I was right there with them. So the question now is, as an intermediary that doesn't provide those direct services, what role can we play in ensuring that we're looking at variation, that we're looking at heterogeneity? I can't even say it. So the one thing that I came to learn as we were talking with our educators, the ones who had the breakthroughs with those children were the ones who took the time to build a deep, deep, deep level of trust. So one of the things we've got to do at the Spartanburg Academic Movement that we're working on is doing just that. We have to build an organization where our community really trusts us to come in and to support them in doing this work. So building that trust and engagement is often easier at the neighborhood level, where I have 1,500 residents, you know, on the north side, than it might be at the county level where we have 360,000 residents. Resource allocation is something that we're having to think about, because we want to make sure that as we're serving the county, you know, we're being even more efficient with the specific needs in a neighborhood. The other thing I would note that's so critical to our work now that I've learned is this whole notion of cultural competence. Fernando, I can't remember what you said a second ago. You know, it was 99 point something percent, but there was a high number of things that are different, even within, you know, that 99.9%. So making sure that as we're doing this work in our neighborhoods, that we are really learning about the backgrounds, the community, and those things that are important to them, so that we can create a quick feedback and adaptation loop. And that's the other thing about this kind of work, is it allows us to have a continuous improvement mindset and really be able to adapt and change as we're, you know, trying new interventions. So Hello Family is an initiative that I hope people can take some time to go and look at. It started as a citywide effort. We've seen great successes, so now we're scaling that countywide. So that's one of the hopes. But yeah, it sounded complex to start with, but at the end of the day, it's really, you know, what we try to do as parents with our own children who are so different.
And I appreciate that. The word heterogeneity does not exactly roll off one's tongue. And yet, as you start to talk about it, it resonates a lot with experience, both of what your grandmother could have told you and what you see in programs every day. And I appreciate your nuance of, as an intermediary, what is this? How do you apply this concept? And what does that look like in these kind of different levels where we can think about it?
And how do we look at data?
Yeah. All right, so we've been talking about science and practice related to individual variation, and now we're going to shift to talking a little bit more about kind of between group differences and systemic inequities. Before we move on from this section, though, I want to emphasize a key point. And then it looks like, Fernando, you have a key point you might want to emphasize too, but let me put this one out there. I just want to say out loud, so it's important to understand that early experiences have a powerful influence on lifelong well-being, but they don't determine destiny. So early is better, but it really is never too late. And so the early years are important, and yet it is not, there is always an opportunity. And so earlier is better. Fernando, do you have a point you want to add in before we transition to the next question?
No, just very briefly. What is important to stress is that, as Russell was saying, there are approaches to whole communities, and within those communities, there are approaches to each child within that community. That is the basic message of this discussion. We have to have global approaches to communities that have been underprivileged and who have not had the same opportunities as other communities. But at the same time, within those communities, we need to take into account that every child is different. And if we try to have the same solution for every child, we're not going to succeed as much as we can tailor what we're doing to the needs of every child, or we could even say groups of childs within those communities. Yeah.
If I was in the audience, I would be hearting right now. I see lots of hearts coming through. Awesome. From the emojis. Well, let's continue that. So the question for you, Fernando, is as we've been discussing, what does the term between group differences mean? And what is their connection with social and economic inequities?
Sure. We have known for a long time that certain subgroups within our communities and our populations have worse educational outcomes, health outcomes, less opportunities than other communities. That is well known. And there are structural aspects to that. Parents that are poor or that suffer racism or that are discriminated cannot provide the same opportunities to their children as those who don't suffer those inequities. And therefore it creates a structural problem because parents are poor, children don't have the same opportunities, they have much more likely to be poor, and on and on. Now, as we have said repeatedly, this has nothing to do with genetics. This has to do with the initial conditions that were created for these populations, which in the case of racism have very, very long-term roots that are still present today. There are two ways in which you can face that. And again, we are going to repeat what we said before, but it is important. One is, and that is very important, to have global programs to address the needs of those communities. And we have many of those programs, and we spend a significant amount of resources in our country to address those needs. Mm-hmm. But we have been discovering that when we do that, often we don't get the results that we want to get. And that has to do with the other aspect we were discussing, mm-hmm. which is that within even those groups, there are wide variations that are much larger than variations that occur between groups in terms of genetics, in terms of so many determinants of the way children respond to what is given to them, mm-hmm. as assistance or as support. Mm-hmm. It's very important, therefore, to consider both those issues. But going back to the differences between groups, there are significant biological correlates to those differences. Something happens to those children that what we call biological correlates. Their biology is also different, created by those conditions, but it has nothing to do with genetics. It has to do with the fact that when you live in those conditions, when you live in violence, you have to adapt and the body changes. And that's what is important to understand. And that is what determines the result of that inequity is what determines that these children have worse outcomes and so forth, not because they don't have the potential to thrive like any other child.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that. And it's, we've talked about in early development, like it's adaptive. Actually, you're adapting to your environment in a way that's about survival and is very healthy, but it's responding to that. So thinking about that, is there any further connections? You were starting to go there sort of between group differences and the social and economic inequities and connecting it to our biology. Any further thoughts there you want to add? And then We'll go on to asking Russell a question.
Children that live in these underprivileged communities as a result of the factors that we have talked about, socioeconomic factors, racism, discrimination, and so forth. Those children have less opportunities, for example, to have good nutrition. And therefore, the problem of obesity is much more significant in those communities than it is in other communities. Mm-hmm. The fact that in those communities, there is usually more exposure to contaminants in the environment. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there's more toxic exposures that these children are subject to. Mm-hmm. There's more violence in those communities. And therefore, the children are more likely to grow in an environment of stress. And stress creates chronic changes in our body because we're trying to adapt to this environment that is being created there because of the conditions that exist in those communities. Therefore, there is very significant biological correlates to those exposures. There are also, and I'd like to stress that because that's what the working paper says, there are also differences between children even within those communities. So what we're saying is there is the need for society to address this issue with resources, but those resources need to be tailored to those communities on the one hand and to each child within those communities. And that's the change we're proposing. Let's think about supporting those communities, but at the same time think about supporting specifically the needs of each group of children or each child even within those communities.
That makes so much sense, and I feel like it's evoking another science concept of sort of place matters, and how what surrounds you how what surrounds us shapes us, and how the environment affords opportunities or adversities from the conditions around children, and how that creates experiences for them, and what that means then.
We're not
Yeah.
the result of we're not genetic machines. We are the result of the way in which our genes interact with our environment. And I just said that we're similar by 99.9%. We're different by 0.1%. That 0.1% is very important because it's there to adapt us differently to different environments. Let's use that. That's a strength of ours, not a weakness. It's a strength being different in the way we react to the environment. Let's use that strength to give to each child what each child needs.
Oh, I love that. I love thinking of it as a strength. All right, let me come to you, Russell. So connecting this to a thread from earlier, I'm curious how the Spartanburg academic movement is working to address this type of social and economic inequities and experiences that Fernando's just been describing.
Well, Fernando, I know you're a scientist, but it sounds like you're ready to come do some place-based work. So he gave a great explanation of what this looks like. I'll just say for us, one thing I didn't mention when I talked about organizations like mine, we work at the systems level. So, you know, we're looking for systems change and systems transformation. That's why it's so important that we bring those entities who are leading a lot of these systems together. I led a school system, and I know that there are some things that if I could go back, I would do a little differently, you know, even in that role. Listen, so the world is more polarized. Everything's politicized right now. We're dealing with a lot of, you know, different ideologies, and but the beauty of this conversation today, I think the one frontier where everyone can still come together is around our children. So that's why I think, you know, really focusing in on this is something that we can all really come to. So as we're trying to address, you know, these inequities that we have here, and look, I'm in the South where a lot of those inequities, you know, have been around for hundreds of years now, and we're trying to unravel some of those systems. But it starts with strengthening ourselves as an organization. So one, I want to make sure that the people who work for the Spartanburg academic movement, that we understand and care deeply about this work and about systems change. We're in a year-long engagement right now with a consulting firm helping us really understand what it means to be a systems leader, because that's what we're ultimately trying to change. Part of that is also being willing to tell the truth about what's working and what's not working, to be able to tell the truth about where disparities are. And I know, you know, certain language is difficult to use these days, especially if you're, you know, in the context in which I'm operating. But it's important that we can speak to everybody about this work. The other thing is that we don't do it alone. This requires the community to come along beside of us. So I mentioned the Faith Initiative to end child poverty here. Jack had a conversation with them when he was last here. You know, it's great for churches to send backpacks home with children on Fridays because they're hungry. But it's even better if 600 churches can come together and say, let's do something about food insecurity in Spartanburg County. Let's address the system. We've got a Spartanburg Racial Equity Collaborative that we fund and support to bring them together around these issues of race and how race has really helped perpetuate some of these systems. I've looked at some of the papers that have been published through Jack's Center, where it talks about the impact of race and trauma when it comes to children and families. And then we've got a stable of national partners who are also looking to solve these systemic inequities. I mentioned Strive Together and Purpose Built, but you've got organizations working in rural communities like Partners for Rural Impact, the William Julius Wilson Institute out of the Harlem Children's Zone, Results for America, the Children's Funding Project, and our partnership at Harvard with Ed Redesign. They're all working together to try to address some of those systemic issues. And then the last thing I would say, Corey, is, you know, we've just got to be in a constant state of learning. I've learned so much over these last 3 years. I wasn't thinking about variation and heterogeneity until I started this fellowship at Harvard and affiliated myself with Jack Shonkoff. Raj Chetty's work now, not just around upward mobility, but his work around social capital and the impact that it has on upward mobility and interconnectedness, and how, you know, we can strengthen those ties between people with different socioeconomic backgrounds. So just how we're approaching this work right now, I think is right, how we're having these conversations. And I think if we continue to work together, we're going to be able to address some of these inequities, but it's going to take local, state, national, all of us working together.
I love it. Just all the different levels of coming together, and even just as you were saying, this sort of, and learning from all of it and sort of pulling in the ideas that work and trying to figure out these are longstanding issues.
And not being afraid to tell the truth about what's not working. You know,
yeah.
we've been fortunate with some of our investments to have partners that have said, you know, we want you to fail. We want you to try some things, to innovate. And so often, we're afraid to talk about what's not working. So being able to experiment together.
Yeah, all the way back to the idea of trust, being able to have that space. All right, I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question for you, Russell, and then we're going to do a lightning round of everybody kind of last words and advice, and leave Jeremy a minute to give us a survey here at the end. We're going to try and do it all. All right. So last question here, Russell. The big idea here is, right, these scientific principles underlying human variation present a powerful yet relatively untapped framework for strengthening the foundations of healthy development in all children. And the question is how? How do we do that? So the paper suggests 3 complementary approaches: broad-based programs and policies, strategic targeting of resources, and flexible implementation. All makes sense in concepts, but I'm curious to hear from you. How do you think about designing to expect variation in effectiveness and planning for flexible implementation? What challenges do you see in trying to do that? And examples from your work. All right, and that's like the hugest question, and like 1 minute so we can get around to everybody.
Real quick, Fernando talked about the global approaches. You've got to have them, but you also have to narrow it in. I'll just talk about one effort I'm really excited about, working with Ed Redesign out of Harvard University. We're part of a national network of partners doing what's called success planning, where you work in the neighborhood. We have family navigators. We have academic success coaches. Children will have a personalized plan. Every child in that neighborhood, a coordinated system, and a backbone that's supporting that work. A data platform where we're tracking the data longitudinally for these children. So there are processes out there like success planning and family navigation where you can get down to the specific level, and there's a plan. Every child is known by name, by face, by place.
Oh my gosh, so much there we could mine. I'm so curious. All right, we have come to the end. So we're gonna bring Jack back up onto the screen to join us here. And we're gonna welcome each of you to share. Hi, Jack, welcome back. We're gonna welcome each of you to share final thoughts or advice with the audience today. So we'll go Fernando, Russell, and then Jack. So to you first, Fernando. Oh, wait, you're muted though. Please unmute.
Very briefly, first, it's great to hear the efforts that Russell is developing there in the community with all his partners to make this become reality. I perfectly well understand that this is not going to be easy. It's not being easy for us in medicine, where we have direct biological measures that we can use to see who is going to respond or who is not going to respond. Nobody's proposing to do that in the communities. It will have to be, as Russell has said very well, that locally efforts are developed so that these specific characteristics of children that are going to be addressed, not only as for them as part of that community, but for that child specifically, are developed. It's going to be difficult, but imagine the potential of doing it this way. Because what happens now is that we develop a policy. That policy is applied in a certain place. Some children do well, but some other children don't do well. We don't do anything about them. They are just left. It's not fair, but also, on the other hand, does not use all the potential of all the children. If we put the accent on what makes children different in the way they respond to the environment, we don't need to know why they're responding differently. What we need to know is what can we do? How can we experiment to see new ways in which, using those differences, we can get the best out of every child?
Oh, love it. Inspired. All right, Russell.
Inspired. So I'll just add to that a short poem that we read as a staff last week. It's a Wendell Berry poem, and it talks about our real work. And he says, it may be that when we no longer know what to do, we've come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, that we've come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. To Fernando's point, it's complicated work, but it's a new way of looking at this. And I'm just excited. I'm baffled right now, but I'm excited for, where this is going to take us. So thank y'all for letting me be a part.
Oh, even more inspired. All right, Jack, over to you.
Oh God, how can I follow these two people? I just have three very quick points to make. I'll make them in a minute and a half. Number one, anybody who's ever heard me say that anything I've ever been successful at is because I surround myself with people who know more than I know and who are inspiring to work with. Thank you, Russell and Fernando, for kind of being examples of that. This is really so true. I mean, this is another source of variation in terms of different people know different things, and you bring that together. I think the second point is, I want to emphasize something that Fernando said about how biology is basically adaptive. It's always trying to adapt and get things right? And that when you think about experiences and genes and timing, the experiences part is what includes a lot of the good stuff and a lot of the bad stuff. And this is where all things related to culture and context that are disruptive for development are not coming from biology. They're coming from the environment that includes the kinds of forces that really undermine it. But one thing I'd like to end with in terms of my comments, to end on a positive note, is that we've talked a lot about increased sensitivity to the environment, focusing mostly on sensitivity to adversity, which is real and which is true. But there's also a considerable amount of work about the fact that shows that children who are highly sensitive to adversity are highly sensitive to the environment writ large. So they're also more sensitive to positive things in their environment than the average child. And so those children who are more sensitive and are in a supportive environment actually excel in many ways above the average child in terms of creativity and other things. This is how biology tries to survive. Why are those individuals who are so sensitive, why has this not kind of disappeared to evolution? Because societies need people who are more sensitive to the environment. They bring out the best in us, but when we make life hard for them, we make life really hard for them. So I'll end by thanking Fernando and Russell, two people who I consider to be very cherished colleagues and good friends. And thank you all for being part of this.
Thank you so much, each of you. It's been such a delight to be in conversation, and we'll turn it back to Jeremy, who will close us out.
Excellent. Thank you, Corey, and thank you to everyone who was a part of our wonderful and just terrific panel discussion today. Before we close out, I'd like to give everybody in the audience the opportunity to share some feedback on this conversation. So on your screen, you should be able to find a QR code to access our survey. So we'll also be pasting the link in the chat so you can access it via your web browser that way as well. We welcome all of your thoughts or any takeaways that you might have on anything that was discussed today. Additionally, just want to point out that you can follow our social media channels and newsletter to receive updates and information about future publications and webinars from the Center. And finally, just thank you again to our audience for being here today, and enjoy the rest of your day.